Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world. If you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Some of you may recall that when the famous Dan Rather anchored the CBS Evening News, for a very brief period of time, he began to sign off his nightly news broadcast by using the word courage. I think it lasted about a week. And I remember the story because it caused a real stir at the time, inside and outside media circles across the country. His use of the word courage as a tagline was refreshing to some, and as I can see by the audience, odd to many. He actually used it to sign off on his last broadcast after 24 years on the job. Now, why do I raise this? Well, our speaker tonight, Sharyl Attkisson, is also clearly recognizable to millions of Americans for her own work at CBS News for many years. But it struck me when reading her book that her remarkable career from PBS to CNN to CBS, and starting off with lots of TV stations with the W in front of it, is based more than the use of the word courage as a simple tagline. Rather, her life and her work have been about the very meaning of the word itself. So what is courage? I looked it up. It's defined as, quote, mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. Close quote. It's something, I think, one has to have at their very core when investigating major news events. This is particularly so if they involve serious scandals, from Benghazi to Fast and Furious to healthcare.gov. Courage is critical in seeking out what's going wrong at an alphabet soup of powerful government agencies, from the NIH, the FDA, the DOJ, the FBI, USAID, and the DOD. Sharyl has investigated them all and more. Now, fighting these organizations and more to get to the truth, including the bosses at major corporations such as her own CBS News, Sharyl has often been a one-woman oversight committee in Washington who has sought the truth and nothing but the truth for a long time. What's the hard evidence of this? Well, you can start by noting that it's not possible to count on both hands the number of Emmys and Edward R. Murrow awards she has won during her career for outstanding investigative journalism. Andrea Mitchell of NBC has listed Sharyl's book as one of the 5 most important to read to better understand Washington, D.C. But the real evidence of her attempts to seek the truth, no matter where it might take her, or what feathers might be ruffled, can be found in her book. Her book, Stonewalled: My Fight Against the Forces of Obstruction, Intimidation, and Harassment in Obama's Washington, is a bestseller and really an incredible read. I hope you'll read this book. And I hope you'll also join me in welcoming to the stage its courageous author, Sharyl Attkisson. Well, you know, if you've been to events at the Reagan Library before, as many of you have, you'll note that most of our speakers come, they give a speech, and they do a marvelous job, but one of the reasons they come is they like to put on their resume that they've given a speech, they spoke at the Reagan Library. What we'd rather have them do, because it's so much more engaging, especially for the audience, is just have a conversation up on stage, and I get a chance to ask a few questions. You get a chance to ask a few questions, and we keep it quite conversational. So I want to thank Sharyl for agreeing to this format of just sitting down and having a chat with us. I think you'll truly enjoy it. Sharyl, welcome to the Reagan Library.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Now, how tired are you? Where did you come from? Have you traveled a long way, or are you on the road?
I came from Washington, D.C., which is a world apart from Los Angeles, weather-wise and everything else. I have quite a few appointments here this week, so I'm delighted to be out of the cold and the snow. It's been a long winter.
Yeah, we've read about that.
And you see a lot of that on the news, as I talk about in the book. I think a lot of times in the path that news organizations are taking to do stories that are maybe less controversial or less original, we tend to do a lot of stories on the weather these days. So in the wintertime, you'll see on the evening news a lot of stories about how cold it is, and in the summertime, you'll see a lot of stories about how hot it is.
Right, right. We're going to talk about a number of very important contemporaneous topics, and particularly as it's related in your book, some of the fascinating investigations that you've been involved in. But I think everybody likes context. So if you will, why did you get into the news business in the first place? People with your kind of talent have the option to go into business or politics or one thing or another, but chasing down tough stories is, it's a gumshoe type of a job sometimes.
It is. I guess I've always liked solving puzzles, figuring out questions that people don't want to answer, the fun of digging up facts that maybe are hard to find or maybe other people don't want you to have. So even aside from considering a career in the news business, which I didn't know much about when I was younger, I was always seeking answers to questions that maybe other people left unanswered. I also have this drive for fairness, I think. I was always comparing things. I call it substitution game in the book, but even when I was in high school, before I considered a career in journalism, I would read the local paper, and I wrote a letter to the editor, I guess I was in 10th grade or so, because I thought the local newspaper was covering sports between the two high schools, my high school and the competing high school, unfairly. And I noted that whenever my high school would, I said, win a football game, even by a fairly large margin, the local paper would seem to say, Riverview barely squeaks by. But when the competing high school would, the favorite high school would win maybe by 1 point, it would just be, Sarasota High School stomps Riverview. They even would criticize our cheerleaders. So I just thought it wasn't fair when you measured the similar circumstances being treated differently by a newspaper that I thought was supposed to be treating things in a fair and unbiased fashion. I noticed that a long time ago, and I continued to look for those inequities. In college, I noticed when I was researching a topic and reading news magazines for a debate class, I started reading magazine articles that were clearly giving opinions, but they were stated as fact without attribution. And I remember approaching one of my journalism professors and saying, gosh, this is an opinion, it's not substantiated or attributed to anything. And he said, well, newspapers and magazines can do that. And I felt very cheated because it sounds naive now, but at the time I thought the news was supposed to present something that was evidence-based and not somebody's opinion, presented as fact. So I guess that's been an ongoing theme as I have pursued this career in journalism.
Yeah, I'd like to follow that line for just a minute because something that struck me I had seen you on the news, watched you report various stories, and in particular, with the ones I remember were Fast and Furious and Benghazi. But there's a lot of pages in your book about having to fight internally at your own corporation, in this case CBS News, to get the opinion out of news, or to convince bosses who otherwise might be reluctant to run a tough story that might take shots at the administration or what have you. There seemed to be lots of politics within the newsroom itself that you were having to fight, and you got fairly specific with respect to particular individuals that would step on your stories. And I just wondered, since your days in high school all the way now up through a very, a remarkable career, you still found those same kind of prejudices or those same political motivations to start or stop a story. And I just wanted you to comment on that, whether or not you ever expected to see that in a professional news outfit.
I think I was surprised a little bit entering journalism how much groupthink there is, because I envisioned you'd get into a newsroom and there'd be a lot of diverse thought, opinion, and discussion and debate, but it all occurs within really a fairly small box in many instances. To the extent that we debate things and discuss things, there's a general area of agreement on things. But I would say for most of my career at CBS, that's part of the job, and I certainly wasn't the only one that would try to throw ideas into the mix. And I accepted that as part of the job, and often had wonderful bosses who kind of embraced that role, the idea that reporters on the ground level and producers were bringing different ideas and trying to make stories be seen a certain way and bringing facts to the table. So I don't feel like it was always an inappropriate tension that occurred. It was part of the process. The last couple of years at CBS, there were just key gatekeepers on broadcast that I felt like there was no give and take. It was simply, as I describe in the book, almost as if they would cast a story and enlist the reporters or producers as a casting agent at times, saying something like, do a story on such and such, find a character, meaning a person who will say such and such. In other words, they already know what they want the person to say, and use these points in your piece. And if you would come back to them, as many producers and reporters would do, and this is not just CBS, this is an issue at a lot of places, but if you would come back and say, that's not what we found, and we found somebody who said this, which is a little bit different, here's what's really happening on the ground. In the past, where that might have been appreciated by managers who want you to fairly pursue a story, managers who would listen to the reporters at the ground level, the last couple of years, in my experience at least, there were managers that didn't want to hear it. So we either had to change the story in a way that I would say was unnatural or even sometimes factually incorrect, or not change it and they wouldn't want to run it. So you're butting heads a lot over those sorts of things, and there was tension not just with me, but a lot of reporters and producers over this idea of us sort of as casting agents. What good reporters and producers want to do, the contribution we feel we make at a national news organization like CBS, is we're pounding the pavement, we're talking to sources. You may read something on the wire services, or you may read something in the newspaper, but we're the experts at our network who say it's a little bit different based on our sources, or here's what we think the story is. That came to be, in my view, no longer valued. They didn't want to hear the original information we could bring to the table, the original stories, the information from our sources. They would say, some of these managers, that's all well and good, but the wire services say this. One anecdote that I tell in the book is about how one producer summed it up in describing the same phenomenon as, we call New York, and New York will tell us in the field, gee, Associated Press, the wire service says the car is red that you're doing a story on. And we'll tell them, well, we're right here and we're looking at the car, and the car is blue. And they'll say, well, okay, but make the car red. So, that in a nutshell kind of tells how if they have a preconceived notion based on their own ideas or prejudices or ideological biases or whatever it is, and they won't listen to you as you try to tell them the facts as you see them on the ground, there can be a real problem with that. And again, it wasn't always that way. Had some terrific experiences for most of my years, and I think there was appropriate tension a lot of the times. But at the end, it got to be pretty insurmountable for me.
Yeah. As you just said, it wasn't always that way. And in relation to that, I was interested because I knew the name of your book was Stonewalled. but until I actually saw it, I didn't see the subtitle. And you make specific reference, and obviously this was done purposely. It's on the cover, and it says, "My fight for truth against the forces of obstruction, intimidation, and harassment in Obama's Washington," which would tell me, you've been a professional news reporter for a couple decades, maybe a little more. You've covered Washington inside and out through other presidencies. Yet you chose to call out President Obama and his administration, not the last 3 administrations. Why did you do that? What is it specific to the Obama administration that you think has turned the world upside down as far as seeking and getting the truth?
Well, part of it is something that's specific to the Obama administration, but part of it is the timing. It just happens to be Obama's Washington when a lot of these factors have come together in what I consider sort of a perfect storm of circumstances that have made it very difficult for original investigative reporting. But I can say that it's not an opinion, it's not just me saying this. There is now a widespread consensus that's been expressed about this by reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the White House Correspondents Association, the White House Photographers Association, you name it. There is a consensus that this administration is the worst that we've dealt with personally for transparency and freedom of the press. We just got downgraded again in Reporters Without Borders for our press rankings on freedoms and so on globally, which has continued to happen under the Obama administration. Particularly disappointing, I think, to the press, because when President Obama took office, I think on one of his first days, he said that he was going to make transparency and fixing the Freedom of Information Act a priority. So wherever you stand on politics, as a journalist, we were excited at the idea that we were finally going to get some tools back, because this has been a problem for years, that maybe the Freedom of Information Act would be repaired a little bit, that federal agencies would be more open. That's always the promise when a new administration comes in, but it's never worked out that way, at least for me. And each administration has gotten somewhat tighter than the last. Clinton was not open. When Bush came in, we were hoping for a big change. There wasn't. When Obama came in hoping for a big change, got even worse. As an aside, by the way, you know this from Washington, but a lot of the bureaucrats who control federal agencies and information flow persist from administration to administration. So some of it, yes, is specific to political party, but some of it is not. Some of it is just how Washington works. And some of those federal bureaucrats just wait for the administration to change when they don't like something, because they know pretty soon the administration will be out, new people will be in, but they'll stay there. But the consensus is developed not just because of what the Obama administration has done with very aggressive intimidation and bullying and pushback tactics, but also there's an industry that's grown in Washington in the last couple of years at the same time, I call AstroTurf, where PR firms, instead of special interests using direct lobbying of Congress as much as they used to and campaign contributions, they now turn to these AstroTurf efforts, which are designed to manipulate your opinion by using news media, bloggers, social media, Facebook, Twitter, sometimes fake accounts, nonprofits, commenting online through pseudonyms, all kinds of techniques that you may not recognize. This is exactly who's behind an effort. And it's designed to make you think there's a groundswell of opinion for or against an agenda when there may not necessarily be. Those tactics have been used very heavily and somewhat effectively against the news media, which finds itself ill-prepared to fight back. You know, we're just busy covering the news day to day, and we're facing high-powered global PR firms and efforts with a lot of money who've been planning this sort of thing for 10 years, whether it's editing Wikipedia pages by realizing years ago that they could get editing power to be able to skew certain pages and watch pages on behalf of corporate or special interests on Wikipedia, whether it's developing pseudonyms and fake accounts. Someone told me 50 people can easily control 500 Facebook and Twitter accounts, you know, under names that look like real names and people that look like real people, but they're working for PR firms to make you think there's a groundswell of opinion. So that's happening at the same time. So as news organizations try to do their job, they're facing this barrage of social media that's all against you if you're going up against a certain interest, and they're facing phone calls. And then the regular news media, in its current copycat syndrome, will pick up some of this popular pop culture propaganda. It works its way into the mainstream media, and pretty soon you guys at home are watching news and you're thinking, they're saying everybody thinks something, but I don't think it, but am I weird? Well, no, you're not. There's actually a big percentage of you out there thinking that, but this whole media AstroTurf campaign is trying to make you think you're the only one, or there's only a few of you who have this improper opinion. That's how I describe part of why these forces have come into play.
So, at least speaking of this administration, what has been the Obama administration's role in all that?
Well, they're very clever in using, they're very well organized. They're clever in using social media. You know, the internet is bigger than ever every year. The internet hardly existed. I guess it didn't exist at all in Reagan's time. And, you know, so as it's gotten more widespread, people have learned how to use it more as a strategy. That's just a natural outgrowth that it would be used this much. But one aggressive thing I think they do that's a little bit different, we've always heard from administrations if we're doing stories that they don't like. That's not new. What is new is this administration, in addition to using its blogging partners to put out their talking points and the news media to do it, they launch these aggressive campaigns on a daily basis, and not just with CBS or me, but anybody who's doing reporting that they don't like. They may call 3 times a day. They may fan out their phone calls. In other words, one person from the White House might call my bureau chief after I've done a story on healthcare.gov. Nothing wrong with the story, legally approved by our internal folks, gone through the editorial process, no fact errors, but they don't like it. So they'll call and just raise a ruckus. And my bureau chief once in a while used to say to me, you know, Jay Carney's on the phone, what's he calling about? And I'm like, you know, he probably doesn't like tonight's story again. And he would kind of chuckle, like I would say the next day, what did Jay complain about? And he'd say, he didn't really have anything specific, but he would call the calling and the harassing and the bothering the managers, and then someone else may call the news anchor, and then they email, and then someone else may call the news division president. They fan out, and they do this in the hopes, I believe, that there's some effect of self-censorship, because who wants to go through that? I mean, I didn't mind it because I don't mind the fight, but I think most people, you know, they avoid a sharp stick in the eye. And if you know that every night after you do a story like this, you're going to get called at home, and you're going to, even if your bosses stand behind you, but you're going to still have to spend time explaining and discussing and going over details, and they're going to have to do this on their own time. Pretty soon, I do think there's a tendency to think, gosh, why do the story tomorrow? We did one yesterday, took all those calls. And again, I've compared notes with acquaintances of mine in other news media. They get the same treatment. They get the same phone calls. They get the same, you know, barrage. There's a pretty good, I think, example in the book of when the administration was pushing back against some story I did, and I don't even remember the topic. But they clearly had a meeting, worked out a strategy, and sent email under different signatures of different White House officials that were word for word identical for the most part, but pretending as though each one had been just organically typed by and sent out naturally by a press person to somebody at CBS. But if you put them side by side, even down to the punctuation, these had been crafted together clearly at some sort of meeting and sent out as a strategy. So when you look at it that way, you can see they had a pretty well-developed effort. And to some degree, again, I think that's successful.
Yeah. Your book focuses, well, you've been involved in so many investigations over the years, and I'm sure they're not all in your book by any means, but you focus in particular in certain chapters on some of the most high profile. And I'd like to start with one that looks to me like an obvious candidate for the 2016 presidential election, presuming Hillary Clinton moves forward as the Democrat nominee, and that's Benghazi. And I wondered if you would give the audience just a little bit of context, just very brief in terms of what's Benghazi about, but your particular role and the fight that you've had to endure in order to try to get to the truth on the situation.
Well, this story followed a similar pattern as I describe in the book that I faced, my producers and I faced the last couple of years. I wasn't originally covering Benghazi. I'm not that interested in stories that are well covered by other people. They're doing the job just fine. I like to find information that other people aren't turning up, or maybe a different angle. But about 3 weeks into Benghazi, CBS asked me to join in and start looking into it because they thought there was something more there. So this was the period of the story in which they wanted it. And so for a couple of weeks, I dug into it. My producer and I produced a lot of really good, interesting, original material information, because the first thing I noticed, I mean, what I almost do at the beginning of any story is put together a timeline, what happened when, you start to research what's going on, who said what, and there's so many discrepancies and so many missing blanks. So that tells you something right away, that 3 weeks in, the administration hadn't told us when the attack or attacks ended. And in fact, they were almost leading people to believe it had been a very short period of time. So once I couldn't get them to answer the question when the attacks were over, and they seemed to be wanting us to think it was a very short night, that gave me a hint. Why do they want us to think it's a short night? Then I started having sources in special operations corners telling me it went on for a long time and we could have rescued those guys, and controversies were raised. So we started digging in, and long story short, the more information we dug up, the more upset and apoplectic the administration became, which usually tells you something else is going, you know, you're digging in the right area. But at some point, the light switch went off, and CBS went from wanting the stories very much to not wanting them. You could tell there was sort of a discomfort with the stories, and as they got closer and closer to, you know, key people in the administration. And then at some point, they just didn't want to hear it anymore. And you never know as a reporter what has taken place and exactly why it is, because they don't tell you that. They just suddenly go from saying, give us as much as you can on this story, to acting like you're crazy for bringing them the story, you know, almost sometimes in one day. And you're bringing them stories that are better than the ones they liked 2 weeks ago, but they won't air these more important stories now, so you know something's amiss. And that was sort of the pattern that happened with Benghazi.
There's an interesting angle to Benghazi that you followed to its end, which most in the media did not, and I really think the public didn't, and that is in the sequence of presidential debates between President Obama and Mitt Romney, this issue of Benghazi came up, and you know, as you will attest to in your book, Mitt Romney did extremely well in the first debate, and the president was reeling, and in the second debate, the president came back with a hard right and basically said to Romney, well, you're just factually incorrect with respect to what you just said about Benghazi and my position. And I wonder if you'd pick up the story from there, because it's really interesting. The election could have had a potentially different outcome if that story had been followed to the end.
Well, let me take back a couple days before the debate. I was already asking questions about Benghazi, but not the question of when it was called terrorism. Hadn't looked into that, didn't care about it, didn't know that was a sensitive issue. But a couple days before the debate, someone from the White House called me and said, we were talking about something else related to Benghazi, and he threw into the conversation, you know, the president called it a terrorist attack the next day in the Rose Garden. I didn't know if he had or hadn't, and I didn't know why this had been brought up. And I didn't say anything because I didn't know whether to agree or not. I had no information. So we talked a little longer, and he brought it up again. You know, the president called it a terrorist attack next day in the Rose Garden. So I made a mental note. I'm like, that's kind of weird that he keeps saying that, but okay. I watched the debate with everybody else, and Mitt Romney brought up the idea that the president had not called it terrorism. Candy Crowley jumped in from CNN and said, no, you know, the president's right, he did. And I'm thinking, this is too weird, because a couple days ago, you know, I got this phone call. I wonder if Candy got the same phone call. Was somebody trying to prep us in advance of this debate to have our minds set a certain way? So I still didn't know the truth of the matter, but I know watching the debate, as some of you did, that Mitt Romney's face, he looked so shocked. And Obama looked so uncomfortable. He kept saying, move along, Governor, move along. And I just thought the whole thing was very strange. So I said to myself, I'm going to look up, instead of believing what other people's interpretations are, I'm going to go look at the Rose Garden speech. And I did. And I thought the Rose Garden speech was very clear, as we now know. The president, Jay Carney, Hillary Clinton, they used every synonym in the dictionary except terrorism to talk about it. And if you see that, it's very clear. However, the president did segue partway through his speech into the anniversary of 9/11 and said something like, no act of terrorism will go unpunished. So I thought he had a little wiggle room there. He couldn't say he called Benghazi a terrorist attack, but he did evoke the image of terrorism in the speech. That's how I saw it. What we didn't know at the time was CBS News had an interview with the president in the Rose Garden the next day. Someone from 60 Minutes, Steve Kroft, had done an interview that had never aired asking about Benghazi. And the president had just finished his Rose Garden speech, and Steve Kroft had said to the president in this interview that had not aired, that I didn't know about, Mr. President, you purposely avoided using the word terrorism in referring to Benghazi. And the president said, right. So the president is there agreeing with Mitt Romney in a segment that we never aired, but I didn't know about. And the time that you would, maybe it wasn't newsworthy at the time because we didn't know this was going to be a controversy, but certainly after this became an issue at the debate, this is the time when you pull out that piece of an interview and you say, as CBS News, how proud you are that you actually have something to contribute to the conversation that answers the question that's original to your viewers, but they didn't pull the interview out. And in fact, not only did they keep that quiet, and I don't know specifically who to blame, except I will tell you that Evening News had the transcript, had been provided this information and access to this soundbite by 60 Minutes. So it was Evening News that had it and didn't use it, should have and could have, in my view. But what's worse, as we continue to cover the controversy, another correspondent and I, on separate occasions, were finally told about this interview, but never given the whole transcript or clip, but directed by New York to use a different clip in a context we were told to use, not knowing it was incorrect, that made it seem like Mitt Romney was wrong and the president was right. In other words, we used a piece of the clip, not the operative one, later in the interview in a context that made it sound as though the president had pretty much called it terrorism, while we sat on the real responsive piece of the interview that we should have aired. Didn't know any of that until the Friday before the election. And the Friday before the election, it was, there were enough people inside CBS who were upset about this and did know about it, that word got out. And word got out to another correspondent who called me, and this person read the transcript. At first, I'd heard of it, and we both just had this moment of, oh my gosh, we've had this interview for a couple of months and we've sat on it. So that began a terrible weekend of us working with the bosses at CBS who agreed with us that this should have run and should not have been kept off the air, and agreed to get it published before the election. And we did publish it, I think, the Sunday night before the election online.
Yeah.
I mean, my view was, and my argument was, which nobody disagreed with, it's belated, but we better get this out before the election, because if Obama wins and it comes out afterwards, and it surely will because enough people were talking about it, it will look like we sat on something till after the election. If we publish it now, it's not good because we didn't publish it when we should have, but at least we've gotten it out prior to the election, and we did. Yeah. And that's that story.
Yeah. And I did. That's an. I don't really know if you have an answer for this, but I would bet that 70, 80, 90, 95% of the audience here is to the right of center. I'll say that. The constant refrain, as you know, having dealt with this for many years, is that if you are to the right of center, your concern always is that, well, the news media is just not fair, and they don't treat Republicans or the conservatives with any sense of fairness, and they're biased and all this. And when I read that story, I just thought to myself, some will look at it and say, there, it's proof positive. And you don't know if this is an isolated case to a specific producer or a specific person who happened to work at CBS at the time, or in your experience, you say, no, I have to agree with you. That's generally the rule of thumb. If you're in the media, you're likely to be of a left of center persuasion, so it is what it is. You're going to have bias against a conservative point of view. What's your view on that?
I would agree. You know, I've been called liberal my whole career until fairly recently when I started doing Obama stories, but I was always liberal before that. And I would agree that there are more people attracted to the media who are left of center than right of center. But I would argue that that doesn't inherently make us unfair, and I would argue that most of the people I've worked with, the producers and correspondents on the ground, have been extremely fair. One of my best bosses, who I like to talk about, Rick Kaplan, a couple years ago, I think he's good friends with the Clinton. That's what I was always told, and he calls himself a liberal, and he never tried to influence the direction of my stories. I did tough reporting on the Bush administration, but I also did tough reporting on Republicans, and he's the one who led the broadcast with a story about Hillary Clinton, the story that I did, saying that we dodged sniper fire in Bosnia when we hadn't. I was on the trip. It just so happened. I don't look to cover these stories. I really don't. I really don't. I try to avoid politics, but I came home from an international trip, and my husband said a couple years ago, you know, when you were with the First Lady 12 years ago, Hillary Clinton in Bosnia, did you get shot at? Because I had not mentioned such a thing. And I said no, and he said, well, Hillary Clinton's telling people that on the campaign trail. And I said, no, maybe she went back, she must be talking about another trip. Long story short, she was talking about our trip. I looked at the video. I was very baffled because there was some potential danger, but nothing materialized. And my boss, Rick Kaplan, who was friends with the Clintons, had me do a story on it, showing, as she was saying, we landed under sniper fire. I was showing the pictures of her getting off the plane and greeting little 8-year-old children and shaking hands with troops. And he led the broadcast with it. And I remember saying to him, as he was approving the script, I don't think he changed a word. And I said, this must be awkward for you, and he just said, a great story is a great story. So just because someone is conservative or liberal or whatever they might be, when you're trained in journalism, I think you're supposed to be able to suspend your ideas, especially if you have the help of other people editorially reminding you. We all may tend to occasionally let our biases slip in, but that's why there's an editorial process. So that's a long way of answering the question that I don't think that inherently has to be an obstacle, the idea that there's maybe people of certain political persuasions, and it's not always a problem. I think the last couple of years at CBS, there were key people in key spots, and I'm not even talking about the very top of the organization, and certainly not at the ground level with the reporters and producers, but a couple of key gatekeepers of the broadcast in key positions can change the whole tone and tenor of the broadcast. And you have to decide if you want to keep your job and contribute. I'm either going to bend to what they want to do even if I don't like it, because that's kind of my job, is to do what they want, or I'm not going to do what they want. And where does that leave me? I've got kids to put through college. I like my job. These are tough choices for people to make.
Yeah, understood. We've got some time for questions from the audience, and if you don't have any questions, I'll keep right on asking mine. So what we're going to do is we have staff in the aisleways who have microphones, and so if you have a question, you just raise your hand high. They'll bring a microphone to you, and all I ask is that you use the microphone, make sure it's there before you have to ask your question. We'll start over here. We've got a hand up back here.
I want to ask you a question. In the American Rifleman, on the January issue, you were mentioned in there as far as the Fast and Furious, and part of the major contributor breaking the story. And they were quoting that you had said that the way the information was distributed was quite cynical. And I'm wondering, in the American Rifleman, were you interviewed by them, and where'd they get the information?
What did they say that I had said? I'm sorry.
What did they say?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say what they quoted me as having said. That the information was what?
The way the information was distributed, which was on November Eve election, that you had said that the Department of Justice, they were quite cynical in what they have done in releasing the information. And I was just curious as to if you were interviewed by them or where they got the information in Fast and Furious.
Who publishes, is that published by the NRA?
Yes, it is. I'm a member of the NRA.
The NRA did interview me, so I assume that was an accurate quote. I did speak to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right over here.
Hi. First of all, your book is awesome. And
Thank
as I was
you.
reading it, there were parts of it that frankly scared the bejesus out of me. So I have, if I may, two questions. One of them somewhat personal, and I would certainly understand you declining to answer it, but it's with regard to the mysterious activities that happened to your computer and other ways that your family was technologically assaulted, I will say. Did you ever fear for your life?
I answer that question by saying my view of people that turn to illegal and surreptitious tactics to monitor journalists that they're afraid of, those people are cowards and they're bullies. I kind of view them the same way as you would view a schoolyard bully that turns to the wrong kind of tactics because they don't have the confidence in themselves, to take care of business the proper way. That's how I view it.
My other question is with regard to Benghazi, which I find fascinating. Recently here we found out about Mrs. Clinton's secretive emails or her server that is in her possession. And Trey Gowdy saying that there are 3 months of missing emails or emails that they have not received, all surrounding the time of the attack in Benghazi. Do you feel that those emails still exist? And if so, what are the chances that that committee will ever see them?
My experience teaches me that if there are any emails that would be that bad, we will never see them. Would you not rather be in trouble for having a gap in time if the emails are that bad than turn over the emails? I would also say the Clintons, not to be mean, but historically, if you look at their record on records, there is a long, I urge you to Google something, I think it's called 19 times the government hid documents they didn't want you to see. And I was looking at past incidents in which documents have been said that they were missing and maybe turned up later, but clearly false information, clearly missing information that should be there. It does involve some of it. The Bush administration, look, every administration and every federal agency has had its issues, but there are many of them involving the Clinton administration, some of the same people back when Bill Clinton was president who now work with Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's White House counsel who became one of her top advisors, who was also named as being somebody, Sharyl Mills, in a court case who a judge said her behavior was loathsome and not turning over documents and something completely unrelated. In another case, she was pinpointed as somebody at the White House who was going through Freedom of Information lawsuit requests and congressional subpoena requests and blocking the release of information. So this is not new. It's not surprising at all to me. What bothers me most about any search for truth, no matter what agency is in charge or what administration, when a huge amount of time passes, way too much time has passed for us to get, I think, to be sure we can be confident of getting at the truth of some of these things. When Benghazi happened, to have the best chance at getting at the truth of what really happened, almost immediately information needed to be obtained. But everybody knows now that if there's just enough of a delay, if you can delay Freedom of Information Act requests for a year, 2 years, 3 years, if you can put off congressional subpoenas, because they don't really do anything about it if you don't answer the subpoenas, pretty soon everybody gets on the same page with a story. They correct the things that weren't quite right. They all come together. The conversations happen behind the scenes. What chance do we really have 2.5, 3, 4 years later to get at the original documents? You may have read the story I did on a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State who worked for Hillary Clinton, Raymond Maxwell, saying, and I find him very credible, that he came across a basement operation as the State Department was preparing documents for the Accountability Review Board, in which he says he was told this was a document separation organization to call out embarrassing documents that could embarrass Secretary Clinton or her top staff. That's very much in line with what we know, the sorts of things that we know have happened in the past. I think it's a little late to be hoping we'll get at all the full information and that we would ever see all the full emails. And again, something that's come to light that's probably always been an issue, but maybe more so now than that we notice it more. When the very policing agency, in this case, for example, the Justice Department, who would be looking at the malfeasance or the activities of another federal agency or official, is in charge of that, I mean, where are you left? The Department of Justice, in my view, does not properly answer Freedom of Information Act requests, so are they really going to come in and help facilitate the release of information by federal agencies when they actually go to court and defend them when you sue these other agencies? They're certainly not going to then facilitate the proper handling of that law, in my view. So you've got that conflict, and I don't know how you resolve it.
Let's see, do we have someone? There's plenty of people over here. Do we have a microphone near them? Yeah, great, thank you.
Good evening. You mentioned the gatekeeper situation. Why is there this emphasis on these new squelchers of fact and information? And why have these gatekeepers changed from what they were previously? The second thing I'd like you to comment on is the uniformity in the news. When you look at Channel 2 and 4 and 5 and 7 and 9, why are we seeing the same stories done the same way?
I'll address that first, the homogenous nature of the news, and I say in the book, I think it's because we all use similar processes to decide what to put on the news, which leads to, with all the things happening in the globe on a given day, you may watch the news at night and not see the story at all that you care most about, but you will all see the same lead story on the weather, the same cute feature about an internet animal, and the same poignant closing piece. I mean, there's examples in the book where I talk about the newscasts side by side having almost exactly the same material, discretionary material, that it's not as though it all had to be on the news that day, but they picked the same things. And that's because of what I see as the formula that they use these days. Even though they know that our audience is dwindling and that we theoretically have to bring you something different and original, at the same time, they don't want to take the chance of bringing a controversial story that they have to defend the pushback against. So that means waiting for another news outlet to publish something first, and then they can jump aboard. It means a lot of copying from pop culture, media, following up on what they see CNN have, or the New York Times have, or the Washington Post has. There's a lot of copying. That's safe. It's what I call safe. There's a lot of the idea that there are certain ideological biases at times, but that's not always the problem. There are corporate influences. Maybe they don't want to go up against corporate partners or advertisers, so that rules out a slice of stories. And by the time you decide you're going to rule out all of these other stories that could cause headaches or offend the wrong people, you all end up with sort of the same little ball of news. And I would argue that on those given nights, we're not necessarily serving the public. And part of one thing that motivated me to write the book is I've been told the last couple of years so frequently by family members, friends, people I run into, Democrats, Republicans, people who consider themselves neither, they would always go, why didn't I see story X on the news? Like, it's not even there at all. And I think that was a huge change, because a long time ago, or several years ago, you might see a story and you might think it's slightly skewed, but we would at least try to give some attention to both sides of it. There came to be a tendency I saw in the last couple of years by certain bosses. They didn't want you to see the story at all if they were afraid you might draw the wrong conclusion about it. In other words, they don't even want you to have the facts, lest you, the public, come to the wrong conclusion. And where I stand on a lot of news stories, a lot of people think out, I think wrongfully, what conclusion you might draw if you hear a story. They want you to have a certain conclusion or takeaway. I don't. I want to bring forth facts, especially ones people don't want you to have. And once you see them all, if you say, I don't care about that, or I disagree with that, that's your prerogative. And that's not where I'm not trying to force you to think a certain way or convince you. I just want you to have full information before you make up your mind. But I think there are a lot of people who think their job is to convince you of something one way or the other, and they've gotten to be, sometimes they lack confidence in what your decision will be on something they care about, so they'd rather you not hear about the issue at all. That's my view.
Yes, over here.
You were just mentioning that the decision as to whether you cover a story or not is the bias. And I wanted to harken back or ask you about the Rose Garden story that you were talking about, Obama and Mitt Romney, and how it was edited in such a way. Is that footage, is that in a dead room? Is it on Edward Snowden's hard drive? Is it in Chappaqua, Rose Law Firm? Is that gettable? Has someone got that it's away from the station on digital somewhere?
You mean right now, or when
Yes.
we were? Right now, it's stored in normal digital archives, like everything else at CBS. But we did publish the clip, so that's gettable by just a Google search.
All right, thank you.
You can now see that clip.
Both of them, you can AB them?
You can see where we put it was if you look at a timeline of Benghazi, CBS News and several of us correspondents put together, and producers, a timeline of everything that happened. I think it's called How the Attacks Unfolded. And within that timeline, as the president was talking about it, as you get to that part of the timeline, you can see the clip of what he really said. That's where we put the clip. Where you can find the original clips that they had us use, you would have to Google, and they still exist, but the original stories on the dates, which I don't have off the top of my head, probably the week after the Romney-Obama debate that was operative, and you could see the clip that we used at the time. But that's all written in the book. The text of it is typed out for you to be able to see and compare.
Yeah, the good news is if you read the book, you'll be able to sort exactly where to go get it.
Follow-up, beyond the original Romney clip, how much raw is there around that?
In the finished version that you can find?
What I mean is, how much raw was shot in minutes to get the clip, to pare down, to edit down to the clip that you ended up
That question
using in that
technically
Romney
doesn't quite make sense to me. I'm not sure what you're asking, but the whole interview with the president about the Benghazi Rose Garden part was probably about 2 minutes long. The reason we had it, Steve Croft, who is an excellent 60 Minutes reporter, was already set up to interview the president about something unrelated. And when Benghazi happened, naturally, when he interviewed the president about the unrelated material, he threw in a few questions off the top about Benghazi in case we needed any information from that. So that's why we got that. And that was a very brief segment, maybe, I want to say, when I saw the transcript, 3 or 4 questions off the top, very simple.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We'll go over here.
Hello, my name is Karen Sigmund. I run an organization called Rage Against the Media, and you've long been one of our icons. We hold you up as a model of courage and integrity, so thank you for all you do.
Rage, I mean, that's pretty serious
You stood
stuff.
out as the exception. And one of the things that we do, obviously, is Rage Against the Media. How do you see things improving? Do you see them improving? Do you think alternative media is starting to supplant the mainstream media? And what can we as individuals do to help improve the situation?
Well, I think we need to keep calling it for what it is when we see it. Don't just accept. A lot of people, I think, just have come to say this is how it is. You too can call things out on social media so that you can be a voice that counter and contradicts the AstroTurf efforts that are out there. It matters. You know, you can let other people know. No, 99% of Americans don't think this way on this topic. There's a legitimate difference of opinion. This country, we know, is divided just about 50-50 on probably almost everything. So anytime someone's telling you everybody thinks X or Y, you can point out, if you don't agree and you know your friends don't agree, that there are different opinions, or that perhaps a news organization isn't representing all sides, or perhaps that a blog or some organization that's treated sort of like a news organization is in fact an opinion blog or an arm of a political group, as Media Matters is in my view. And yet sometimes the media treats them almost as if they're a neutral organization, which I've never been able to figure out if they just don't know better. But I think you have a role in calling it out. I don't know that it gets better. I think there are pluses and minuses to being able to find things on the internet and having alternative media. There's a lot of good that's come from that, but as we know, there's a lot of confusion and bad that comes from that as well. I think we're all going to get to the point, and you're probably doing it now, where we start to learn little places you can go on a particular story, whether it's a source or a reporter on a topic only, and that's who you read. But maybe you're not going to sit there and read a newspaper online from top to bottom. You're going to read an article and it's going to connect you to something else or a different website, and you'll find trusted places you can go for certain information, but it's probably not going to be a single source. One thing that really bothered me is I read the other day that Google, probably well-intentioned, maybe not, is working on software, and my understanding of it is to return results when you search. It will cull out the bad sites and give you the most truthful, reliable sites. Think about that. I mean, I was stunned when I saw that, and I can see how some people might think there's a value in doing that, because we all know there's a lot of mess and bunk on the internet. But on the other hand, sometimes I'm looking for that. Sometimes I want to see what's being said. Sometimes I want to see the stuff that conventional wisdom is telling us is wrong, because so often it's proven that the conventional wisdom is wrong. We all know that. Do I really want Google and the people who control Google and the financial interests involved in Google and the political influences who may involve Google deciding which are the good sites, especially on facts? It said that they were going to have some matrix or metrics that look at facts on a website. Okay, so they look at my website, let's say SharylAttkisson.com, and they disagree with things that are factually in dispute, or maybe a matter of interpretation depending on where you sit. Well, they may decide all those facts are wrong, and you won't see, I presume you wouldn't see that website turn up in a search that you're looking for, because someone has decided that's not right. They're going to feed you what they think is right. I think everybody should be stepping forward and saying that's not what we want. I haven't heard anybody who thinks that's a great idea, but I also haven't heard an uproar about it yet. And I would urge you to get involved when you hear things like that and see what you can do to voice your opinion.
Good. I know we've got a lot more questions. Fortunately, Sharyl's agreed to stay afterward for 3 hours to... Actually, she hasn't, but she has agreed to stay after to sign her book, which you have to get signed. So, quick piece of housekeeping. We're going to bring a table up here. She'll sit behind it, and if you, when we're finished up, can form a line, it's going to start, and we'll come up the stage here and across and exit out that way. I would like you to join me in saying thank you to one of the most brightest and professional reporters around. Thank you.
Appreciate it. That's great.
Thank you.